Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little, and recently my students have been crushing it at the poker table at the World Series of Poker. Joe Forsman won a bracelet. Ryan DePaulo recently final tabled the Colossus at the World Series of Poker. At the $25,000 buy-in Seminole Hard Rock Poker Open final table, I was strolling through the hall going to play a tournament, and someone who I did not know walked up to me and said that a month ago, he joined PokerCoaching.com. He was a good cash game player, but had no success in tournaments. And he studied up hard for a month. He devoted his life to studying at PokerCoaching.com. And then, right off the bat, he final tables a $25K. They're crushing it. I guess, to be fair, I don't feel like I'm crushing it, but I'm crushing it too. I won a tournament at Hard Rock. So, what I've decided to do is every month, I am going to hand pick one or two people to back in poker tournaments. We started this 1 month ago, and the first person we backed, Mike, we put him into a $600 Seminole Hard Rock Poker Open tournament, and he ended up cashing for $1,370. And what we're doing is Mike will send us back half of that, and he keeps half of it. So it's a very nice free roll for him. So each month, I am going to be hand picking one or two of you to play in a live poker tournament to be considered. There's a link below this video where poker coaching members can apply. I'll go through them, I'll take a look, and I'll pick a person. So, one of the perks of this is that if I pick you, you can send in hand histories from the tournament that you play for me to review. And Mike was kind enough to send in a few spots that gave him a little bit of trouble. So, let's take a look at those hands and see if Mike can improve his play in any way. Here we have King 10 of Hearts in early position, which is fine enough. I'm raising King 10 of Hearts in almost every scenario. Playing 200 big blinds deep, it's perfectly fine to open it up. And Mike gets a call from a tight aggressive player in third position, and then a tight passive player in the low jack seat. Flop comes 10-9 for 2 diamonds. So this is a situation where you want to generally be doing a decent amount of checking because 10-9x should connect pretty well with the opponent's ranges and not so well with Mike's range. So I think checking is fine. That said, we do have one of our better hands that is also quite vulnerable to being outdrawn. So I also don't mind betting. So if we are going to bet, given we're not betting here all that frequently, we want to bet using a rather large size. That's just because we're betting here with our best made hands and our draws. So we are going to want to bet something like 800 in this scenario, maybe even 1200. I think it's perfectly fine to pot it. Early in a tournament, you're usually going to find that people are not going to view pot-sized bets as a big bet. They're just going to think, oh, it's 1200 out of my 20,000. No big deal. So I like a bet of about 1,000 in this scenario. Mike goes 500, and I definitely think this is way too small. If we were to be betting with a lot of our range or all of our range, perhaps this size could be fine. But the problem is that, like, say we have aces here. Do I really want to bet 500 and let our opponents call with all sorts of gut shots and open-ended straight draws and flush draws and backdoor flush draws? It's like, not really, right? I'd much rather them call more with those hands because then they're just putting money in poorly, or fold. So the same logic kind of goes with this hand. I don't necessarily want to play a pot where our opponent's going to be sticking around with all sorts of marginal stuff. So anyway, Mike bets 500. Only one player calls, turns to 3 of clubs. Same story as on the flop, right? We still have the best hand a lot of the time. I think you're usually going to find that when you bet small on the flop, like 500 into 1200, people typically raise when they think they have the best hand. So if that's the case, when we get to the turn, we probably still have the best hand a lot, right? The 3 is pretty much irrelevant besides backdoor flush draws improve their equity. So for that reason, I think we want to keep betting, and we want to keep betting big, like 2,000. Because if we bet 2,000, now we're giving the draws a pretty bad price to continue. And we also just get called by some worse made hands. Because whenever there are lots of draws available, you're going to find some people become calling stations with hands like Queen 9, Jack 9, Ace 9, Jack 10, stuff like that. I mean, as they should, right? If I'm sitting in my opponent's shoes and I have Jack 10 here, I'm just not folding for any bet. And what essentially happens is as you're betting using a bigger size, you are polarizing your range to the best made hands and draws. This is, at the bottom of the best made hand range, but it's still good enough to value bet, I think, in this spot. Obviously, we lose to a few hands, like pocket jacks, ace 10, 10-9, right? But whenever you bet small on the flop and just get called, I think that discounts those to some extent. So I like a 2,000 bet. Mike goes 1,000 again, so this seems to be perhaps a consistent mistake where he's using bet sizes that are a little bit too small. We'll see if that plays out in the rest of the hands that I have to review. But I definitely would have bet 2,000 here on the turn. River is Jack of Spades. So now, you always want to ask, how does this hand line up with my range and my opponent's range? It actually lines up with our range okay. If we had Jack 10, we'd probably be betting. Maybe not. It's tough to say. But we'd definitely be betting with King Jack, Queen Jack, and King Queen. So we have some nut hands in this scenario. So the question becomes, do we want to have a checking range? And if we do have a checking range, are we check calling at an adequate frequency? And also, if we have a betting range, like how wide is it? And I don't think we need to be betting this hand. If we bet this hand, we're just always getting called by all the hands with a jack, right? So for that reason, I think we just want to check and see what develops. So we do check. An opponent now blast it. What do we think of this? Well, this is pretty bad for us, right? This is the scenario we kind of wanted to put our opponent in on the earlier streets where we could be betting big to put them in a bad spot. Now that we bet, or we face a 4,000 bet, a pot-sized bet, our opponent's range is pretty clearly good made hands, probably two pair or better. Maybe ace-jack type hands are better, although ace-jack's kind of unlikely. Maybe king-jack type hands and better. And then busted draws. So you want to ask, what busted draws are there? And the problem with this Jack of Spades on the river, it lines up really well with draws that would have otherwise busted, like 8-7 got there, right? King-Queen got there. Maybe Ace-Queen of diamonds would bluff. Ace-X of diamonds would bluff. So there are possible bluff combinations. And, we do block King-Queen with the king in our hand. So maybe this is a spot where if our opponent is a little bit aggressive, I don't really mind a call. That said, it is a pretty bad spot to be in. And you have to ask, in this scenario, in live poker especially, would my opponent use this size mostly for value or mostly as a bluff? And you will find, actually, that some players use big sizes or pot-sized bets almost entirely for either value or bluff, but not both. And if you can figure out that about your opponent, then clearly life is great. That said, in this scenario, this is clearly a really bad card for our hand. So we should probably fold purely because of that. But I definitely do not hate calling in these scenarios, especially early in tournaments. Because, first off, it lets your opponents know that you don't like to fold. Also, say your opponent does show up with a bluff. Say that you show up with a rough bluff, like 6-5 of clubs, right? They show up with 6-5 of clubs. That's good. That's telling. Now, our opponent knows you're going to hero call them a little bit. And also, you know that they like to splash around a little bit. All that's good information. The problem with folding is we don't get any of that information. And especially early in a tournament, I'm not going to say I'm going to make horribly bad calls. Like I'd never call here with ace-5, right? But I would consider calling in the scenario with a king-10 type hand. So I probably would have called unless I had some sort of read that the opponent was definitely strong. So anyway, Mike folds and move on with our lives. Facing a 300 under the gun raise, who's active. You can go ahead and 3-bet. Mike makes it 1,000, which I think is great. A tight passive player cold calls. So what type of range do tight passive players usually have? That's going to be a lot of hands like big cards, big suited cards, ace-king, ace-queen suited, ace-jack suited, king-queen suited, queen-jack suited, jack-10 suited, pocket pairs, right? For all we know, all the way down to twos if the opponent loves to splash around with any pair. Some people do, some people don't. But this is one of these spots where I think people really find themselves lost post-flop because they really want to specifically narrow their opponent's range. Like, okay, this guy called my 1,000 raise, so he has jacks or 10s, and that's it. Like, well, sorry, that's not how poker works. The guy's range is defined in some way in his mind, but certainly we have no way of actually figuring that out on our end. So we need to essentially weight it to some extent, understanding that we don't exactly know how it's going to be weighted. So who knows how much of his range is, well, ace-queen compared to ace-9 suited, right? Obviously, he's going to have more ace-queen than ace-9 suited, but it's tough to say, depending on the opponent, right? And we don't know because we're early in the tournament. So the opponent's range is kind of clouded, and that's okay. Under the gun is going to have something reasonable because he raised under the gun and then called a 3-bet. All right, flop comes ace-queen-6 with a heart. Under the gun checks. And our hero bets 1,900. I think this is fine. Anytime the board contains two big cards, you may consider betting bigger with your hands that tend to be the best hand. But this is okay. We could also perhaps just go even a little bit a little bit bigger. Obviously, the player in the low jack seat could just have ace queen or pocket queens or pocket sixes. I don't think that's impossible. But at the same time, it's also unlikely because we have an ace in our hand, right? Like we block ace queen, which is the most likely candidate. So anyway, we go 1900. Ugh, and get min raised. Getting min raised here is awful because the opponent is essentially saying if they actually are tight and passive that they have ace queen or maybe queens or sixes. And it's always annoying when this happens because you don't really know. Maybe they're just overplaying ace jack or ace king or ace 10 or ace 7 for all we know, right? And this is where poker is tough because like right here, if we call and get a good card like a king or a heart and our opponent keeps blasting it, for all we know, if they're the type of player who just may rip it in, we're going to call, pot's going to go up to, 10,000, 11,000. They could just rip it in for 15 or 16. And I would not be shocked if that happens. If that's what they're going to do and we do actually improve on the turn, like say we get a king, we can't fold, but we could still just be dead, right? Again, well, not dead, but nearly dead against queens or sixes. If they have a draw, well, that's another thing worth mentioning. They could have a draw, right? Most people typically don't min raise with draws. But again, who knows, right? So many people want to get in their head that they know what their opponents are doing because they think, I would never min raise with a draw here, so my opponent's never min raising with a draw. Or this player hasn't played very many hands in the first 30 minutes of the tournament, therefore they're tight and passive. Over 30 minutes. It just doesn't matter. I was talking to someone today and they were giving me very specific reads on the opponent, like, oh, they would never play the turn this way. And I asked, so how long have you played with them? Like, oh, a lot, for about two and a half hours. I'm like, whoa! To say you know how this guy's going to play the turn in a very specific spot with exactly his marginal made hands requires a lot of data. And we don't have any data. We have 2.5 hours, which is like nothing. So anyway, right here, what do? I don't know. Depends how much we trust this tight passive read. If we trust this tight passive read to be 100% accurate, to narrow this guy's range to specifically ace-6 suited and better, we should fold. But we don't trust that very often, and it's important to not trust that. All right, we call, turns at 10 of hearts. All right, we check. I was going to say, please don't go all in. And he goes all in. So look, what do I do in this scenario? I just call it off. I don't love it, but we have loads of outs no matter what the opponent has, right? If the opponent has a set, we still have the heart outs and the jack outs. If the opponent has ace queen, we have the king outs, the jack outs, and the heart outs, right? So obviously we're behind. We're putting our money in poorly. But does the opponent ever have a draw? Do they ever have king 10 of spades, jack 10 of spades, jack 9 of spades, 10 9 of spades, 9 8 of spades, 8 7 of spades? If they ever have those hands and we fold, folding is awful. Now, again, this is up to you to figure out how often they actually have those hands. And it's tough to know, but again, these are the types of calls I typically make as long as I don't have any sort of read about my opponent. And if you bust, it's okay, because like worst case, we have loads of equity. And best case, our opponent's drawing pretty thin. For all we know, the guy's just blasting it with ace-jack. That's another consideration. They can just be overplaying, right? If they're blasting it with ace-jack, then clearly folding would be awful. So it's one of these scenarios where calling is usually a little bit bad, or calling is amazingly good. And when that's the case, I typically lean towards calling, but I guess if you can just look in the opponent and they've essentially turned their hand face up as a set, I guess folding's fine, right? It's one of the spots where a lot of people, if they do call and their opponent shows up with a set or ace queen, they're like, oh, I knew I should have folded. But then when they show up with 8-7 spades, they're like, oh yeah, obviously, easy call. And that's not really how poker works, because you don't know what the opponent has, and you don't know how they're going to play. Anyway, Mike folded there, and I think that was probably a little bit... That's fine. Look, it's fine to fold if you're really, really confident in your read. I, though, am not all that confident in hypothetical labels placed on an online poker replayer. All right, here we have limp. We can limp the 6-4. Flop comes 8-7-7. And this is a spot where if you're going to bet, you definitely want to bet bigger. So, Mike, across the board, you want to be betting bigger when you're playing not 10, 15, 20 big blinds deep, especially when your range is relatively polarized. And in all these spots, to some extent, you're saying you have a pretty good made hand or a pretty good draw. And right here, I would definitely bet bigger because we want to get money in the pot with our trips. Yes, we could be beat, but we are just not so concerned with that because we have a really, really good hand. So if you're going to bet, I'd be betting 2,000. And I do like betting in a limp pot. If there was a raise pre-flop, like say someone went raise, call, and you call big blind, I would definitely check the flop, look into check raise. because then one of the two players, especially the pre-flop raisers, are going to be inclined to bet. But in a limp pot, you're going to be less inclined to face a bet because people are just going to check it through. So I like the flop bet, but I would have bet 2,000. Get called by the big blind, which is not really the player you want to get called by. You'd much rather get called by the hijack because big blind has all the sevens, and obviously you lose to all the sevens. That said, big blind also has a lot of draws. So on the turn, I would just keep betting purely for value. The thing is whenever you have a 7 in your hand, you have to realize it's very, very unlikely for you to be against a 7 because you block it, essentially. So you're way more likely to be against a draw or an 8. So now that we're very likely to be against a draw or an 8, I think we can go something like 3,000 on the turn. 3,000 doesn't give the draws great odds. An 8's probably not going to fold. And we just continue building the pot with our trips. So 2,500, again, my slightly bigger bet sizes, especially on coordinated boards. River's a 4. All right, well, we have pretty much the nuts. Some people may look at this and say, oh, but we could be against 8-7 and Queen-7 and pocket queens and pocket 8s. Like, yeah, you could, but you're probably not, and if you are, you lose your money. Again, don't get in the habit of making big folds unless your opponents are literally the weakest, tightest nits who never, ever, ever, ever bluff. And that's not what the label says, so I'm not going to pretend like that's the case. Or, even people who overvalue, right? Some people look at ace-7 and think it's the nuts. All right, so we want to bet. We're trying to get called by an 8. I think we need to go small here. We can't go too big, because if we go too big, what's going to happen is our opponent's usually only going to call us with a 7, and we have no indication at all the opponent has a 7, because a lot of people just raise 7s on the flop or the turn. So we really are just trying to get called by a queen or an 8, and most likely an 8, right? Because the opponent would have had to call the flop with a queen. So I think a small bet here is pretty nice, because if we bet small, we will get called by an 8, which is good. Also, we will perhaps induce the draws to raise. Whereas if we check, yeah, the draws may bet. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But we're not going to get value from an 8 ever, because an 8's just going to check behind, right? If you can somehow tell the opponent's range is like all busted draws, I suppose checking is better. Especially given the opponent hasn't raised at any point with the draws, which a lot of people would do. So I think we just need to go for a small bet of like 3,500. We go 15,000 though. Wow. I think 15,000 is only a good bet size if you just know the opponent has a 7, but I'm not sure in what world we would think the opponent has a 7. So definitely small here. I mean, I like the idea of, all right, we beat everything. This is one of our best hands. Let's use a big size. But you always also want to consider, especially in live poker against most opponents who will call small bet sizes with junky marginal hands and call big bet sizes only with the nuts, not thinking all the draws miss, therefore I need to call a lot. They'll just fold everything besides a 7 here. This is a spot where I think that I would have used a small bet size. And wow, Mike actually gets called somehow by 9-7. I mean, obviously 9-7 is going to call, but it's a situation where it's pretty unlikely you're against a 7, I think. Again, in live poker, sometimes you can just tell. Maybe Mike could tell. But given the way the opponent did not raise the flop, did not raise the turn, especially facing a small bet on coordinated board, you should really not think you're against too many 7s here. But hey, we were. Good job. It's always nice when you're against exactly the hand you want to be against. All right, 8-6 suited. This is splashy. I would fold this under almost all scenarios with a 40 big blind stack unless I have been very tight and passive and everybody else has been very tight and passive. So we raise. We get min re-raised by a tight passive player. That's not good. Now I have to put in 2,000 to try to win a 10,800 or a 10,500 pot, so we need to have 20% equity from out of position with a suited connected type hand. Let's do it. Let's try to get there. And we got there. Boom. 7-6-5 or 6-5-4, 2 diamonds. We check, opponent bets. So now you want to ask yourself in this scenario, how do we get overpairs to fold? That's the goal. Because we beat ace king, we beat most everything besides overpairs, right? So given we beat everything besides overpairs, we don't really care about ace-king because the ace-king's probably not going to be putting much more money in the pot. But aces and kings and queens can actually do a whole lot to mess us up by betting very big on the turn. Notice if we call, pot's going to go to 18,000, the opponent's going to have 28 behind. For all we know, again, they just may rip it in. This is probably the same opponent as before when we had the ace-king. So if that's the case, then I think we probably just want to jam immediately. And you may say, well, the opponent's never folding an overpair if you jam. You'd be surprised, especially if they view this tournament as relevant, as a significant event that they really don't want to bust from. A lot of players will just make big folds, especially if you just, yep, gotcha, and pile your money in, right? If you make it clear to your opponents that you love your hand, you're putting your money in, and there's nothing they can do about it, a lot of people will knit up. You'll be surprised how tight people will play in that scenario. So anyway, I like a shove. Because, again, you're going to get overpairs to fold sometimes. If they do call you, that's fine. You have loads of equity. And that's it. You may say, shouldn't we call to try to induce bluffs? That would be a much better concern if we were late position against late position, or if we knew our opponent was loose and aggressive. But here we have our opponent labeled as tight and passive, right? So against a tight and passive player, this is the type of player who's not going to be bluffing off ace-king, not going to be 3-betting too often pre-flop of bluffs, and certainly isn't going to keep firing at this turn and river with air. Also, another bit of a concern is if they do have a hand like aces, and the turn is a diamond, they may not pay us. So if they don't pay us when we get there, that's also a bit of a bummer. So I think I would just rip it in. You're going to have fold equity, and when you don't, whatever, you still get there every once in a while. We called, turns a 5, we check, opponent bets 6K. This is a little bit nasty now because the opponent's starting to put in a substantial amount of their chips, and I would start to discount discount ace king a pretty good amount. So if we're discounting ace king, that means we're going to be against a whole lot of aces, kings, queens type hands, right? If that's the case, we should probably not raise now, but again, I don't hate it, right? We have all the 5s compared to our opponent. Not a ton of them, I understand, but we have some, and the opponent has none. And also we do have the sets, we do have some straights, and we have loads of draws that would love to shove. So I think I would still just shove it in. River's 3 of diamonds, and now we have to ask, is this opponent ever betting the river? Well, probably not, right? So we can go ahead and forget about that. So if that's the main question we have to ask, should we bet? Should we lead? And the problem here with leading, from a game theory optimal point of view, is like, yes, we have straights and flushes in our range, but our opponent has flushes in their range. They actually do have nut flushes in their range, with ace-king, ace-queen, maybe ace-jack of diamonds. So I think we have to be a little bit careful leading here, because when we lead, we're probably going to get called by overpairs with a diamond, aces with diamond, kings with diamond, queens with diamond. And that's about it, right? Not a whole lot of hands. And when we get raised, well, I think we reluctantly have to fold. So again, will the opponent ever raise us on the river if we bet? As a bluff? Probably not, but some people will. Not very often, though. Probably not a tight passive player in a $600 tournament. So anyway, I don't hate leading, but I think checking's probably just okay, especially if the opponent does have a hand like ace-king, and will take ace of diamonds king or ace-king of diamonds and continue bluffing it. At this point, we are playing 500,000, so we've been playing for quite a while in this tournament, so maybe we have a bit of a read on the opponent as to how often they are actually willing to run turn and river bluffs. And if it is frequently, then definitely check. If it's never, then leading becomes viable. We're trying to get called by overpairs, right? So I'd bet small, given this board we have no bluffs here, right? So whenever you have no bluffs and the opponent's range really shrunk up to mostly marginal stuff, I like a small bet of about 8,000. And Mike goes all in. And I don't like this play either. This is kind of similar to the previous one where, yes, you have a good hand, one of the best hands we can have, but what are we trying to get called by? We're trying to get called by a marginal hand. And right here, like even aces is marginal, right? So I think the only way we get called by a hand like aces is to bet something like 8,000, whereas if we blast it all in, they're just going to fold. I'm sure now that I say that, aces are going to call us. Opponent called. Well, there you go. Kings. Oh, wrong again, Jonathan. Wrong again. Opponent call with literal nothing. Clearly, you don't expect the opponent to call a literal nothing. And to be fair, this actually shows you a big difference in the way players think about hands, right? Kings is an awful hand here, especially king of spades, king of clubs, because they don't block any of the flushes. Also, what do they beat? Eights? Maybe they think pocket eights is going to check, call, lead the river all in as a bluff? That doesn't make any sense. Backdoor heart draw, maybe? Like queen jack of hearts that check called the flop and decided to check call the turn somehow and then decides to lead all in on the river? I don't know, man. But hey, as long as it works, good for you. I am shocked that the opponents are calling you with nothing. It's always nice when they do that, though. All right, we're down to 35,000. Well, opponent has 35,000 effective chips, 1,500, 3,000. and we have King Jack of Hearts in the small blind. This is a pretty easy shove normally. You say opponent frequently raises small blind limps. So I think I actually like limping then. If you tell me you're going to limp a lot, if you limp, your opponent's going to raise you a ton, then raising becomes pretty nice, right? Because you limp, they raise to 10,000, you jam all in, they fold. Good. And if you say if you limp, they're going to jam all in every time, that's not so bad either because King Jack of Hearts does pretty well against a wide range. We could also just open jam. I think open jam is definitely a fine default play. Limping's also fine, knowing you're not folding into a raise. By the way, if you do limp this hand against most people, almost everybody, and they jam you, you have an easy call. So either jam or limp. I think I would probably limp given this read right here, but jamming's fine too. So you jam all any calls with the easy call with ace-4. No, I did anything wrong in that hand. King-queen. Spoiler, we're about to get top pair. We open it up. We're playing 10,000 big blind. And we get a bunch of callers. So they check, and small blind checks. We have to figure out what we want to do with this hand. This is actually a little bit of a dicier spot than it may appear because stacks are pretty shallow, right? If we bet pretty much anything at this point, I don't see how we can get away from this. Just because say we do bet 60K, which Mike does. If anyone raises or jams, there are so many draws they could potentially have that we just have to pay them off. So is that fine? Are we fine getting our money in this scenario? And I think we just are. I mean, you're never just trying to blast your money in 4 ways with top pair, second kicker. But ace-queen's pretty unlikely for the opponents. Queen-10, we block. 10s is unlikely because a lot of them would just re-raise pre-flop. So there really aren't a whole lot of combinations of logical hands that we lose to. And there are a lot of draws that we beat, like King Jack, Jack 9, spade draws. So I like the bet with the idea that we're just not going to fold. So we bet. Luckily, the short stack jams because then we just have a very, very easy call. And we get in against a set. So one of the few combinations that we actually do lose to. And, you know, that's going to happen. Understand that sometimes in poker tournaments, you are just going to run into it, and there's not a whole lot that you can do about that. Notice, funny, given the run out, we probably lose everything, unless our opponent randomly had like 8-7 of spades. But sometimes that's just how it goes. So after this hand, Mike blinded out a bit, got it all in with pocket 4s. He jammed from early position with pocket 4s. Someone re-raised ace-10 offsuit. And the ace-10 offsuit won, which is a-okay. So that is how Mike, the first person we backed from PokerCoaching.com, cashed in the $600 buy-in Seminole Hard Rock Poker Open event for $1,370. Congrats to Mike.